Welcome everyone. We're going to be in Proverbs chapters 23 and 24 today. But before we get into that, quick summary of what we've covered before. We started off with the background of Proverbs in our very first study. And Proverbs is written mainly by Solomon, the vast majority of it, but there are a couple little sections here and there that are not written by Solomon. Namely, we can look at Proverbs chapter 30, verse 1, another title, introduction to a new section, and it reads, "The words of Augur, the son of Jacob the oracle." And then if we go into Proverbs chapter 31, verse 1, we see the words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. So we can see that a couple of these sections are not written by Solomon, but the vast majority of Proverbs is. So if we go into Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1, we have the very first introduction, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So there's Solomon. He's writing this entire long section. And in that first chapter, we also see the audience of Proverbs and the purpose of Proverbs as well. So the purpose to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding. We see a little bit about the audience, to give prudence to the naive or the simple, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, a man of understanding. And we also see the motto of Proverbs in verse 7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, fools despise wisdom and instruction." So you'll see that motto repeated here and there. You also see a general theme of the fear of the Lord in the book of Proverbs, and you'll perhaps notice that if you're looking for it as we read Proverbs 23 and 24, where you'll see that fear of the Lord mentioned here and there. And chapters 1 to 9 is the fatherly instruction of Solomon, where he takes this fatherly role. There's a lot of, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction," such as in verse 8 and other places. "Beware of this, my son. My son, watch out for that. My son, do this, don't do that." And then we get into Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, where we see another title, another introduction to the next section, and it says, "The Proverbs of Solomon." So beforehand, chapters 1 to 9, we were looking at the Proverbs of Solomon. Now we're looking at the Proverbs of Solomon again, but it's slightly a different kind of proverb. Chapters 1 to 9, we saw longer discourse, longer sayings of Solomon that you could easily categorize, especially thematically, theme-wise. And chapters 10 to 22, and pretty much the half of 22, we'll see where that kind of splits off. But that section is the short, pithy sayings that we're more familiar with. So they're shorter sayings, a little harder to organize, but you still can organize them. And then we get into chapter 22, and we looked at this last week, where verses 1 to 16 continues that Proverbs of Solomon short, pithy saying section. But then in verse 17, we start a new section, and this is still by Solomon, but it's actually going to be based on some Egyptian wisdom literature of the time. And we know that because we can draw those comparisons. And the specific Egyptian wisdom literature is called the Instruction of Menomope. And it starts in verse 17, where Solomon introduces it with another title, or you could think of it as a subheading or a heading, perhaps, where he says, "Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise." So he's basically saying, here are the words of the wise, and I'm just going to give it to you and apply your mind to my knowledge. And this section, the Instruction of Amenemope, continues on to chapter 24, and we'll see where that exactly ends. I think it's chapter 24, verse 22 is where that section ends, I believe. But we'll look at that a little more specifically later. Anyway, we went through a lot about Amenemope and why Solomon was using Amenemope and what it means for Proverbs and the significance of that. So you have to remember that Solomon is not just slavishly copying and pasting this or anything like that. He corrects the writing. So in some places it'll talk about gods and a god and other pagan things in Amenemope, Solomon corrects that, and he says, the God, the Hebrew God, Yahweh, is what he uses specifically here, which I don't think Amenemope was using specifically at all. So Solomon's correcting it, and he's putting his own flair on it. There are a number of notable parallels here and there. There's 30 sayings in chapters 22 to 24 from Amenemope, and Amenemope's instruction is, made up of 30 sayings as well. But Solomon goes ahead and puts his own flair on it. He does a lot to increase its value. So he's basically saying, okay, I know you guys, my audience, you're looking for wisdom, and you most likely heard of the instruction of Amenemope then, because it's also wisdom literature. So you're familiar with that, my audience. It's part of the cultural, it's part of these cultural values and things like that. So I want to bring this up, bring it to your attention, and I want to correct a few things. And I also want to put my own spin on it as well. So it's pretty much similar to what Paul does in Acts chapter 17, where he's in the Areopagus. He's in a pagan area, and he's noticing all these different things. He's seeing various idols and things like that. And he goes on and says, okay, I see that you're very religious, right? I see all of these things. You're very religious in all respects. And I see this one idol here, this altar, that says, to an unknown God, is what the inscription says in Acts chapter 17, verse 23. And Paul uses this as kind of a cultural bridge in order to share the gospel with them. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. And he goes on and talks about the true God, as opposed to their idols and their pagan deities and all of the things like that, and the different things that they got wrong about God. He's not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. He also quotes from a couple of their poets as well. In this section is what Paul does. And he's basically saying, yeah, there's a couple of little things that you got right here, but let me give you the full picture. And I think that's what Solomon is doing here as well. He's basically saying that, yeah, you can look around, you can find wisdom in other places, but it needs some correction. It needs a God-centered outlook and attitude around that, not a pagan-centered attitude or anything like that. So I think that's what Solomon is doing in this section, and we're going to continue reading Solomon's flair. I don't want to say spin on. It's kind of a spin on Amenemope. And I probably call this section just the section of Amenemope, even though Solomon is writing it, and it is original. He's not just copy and pasting or anything like that. But just for shorthand, I'll probably call it the Amenemope section. And that starts, of course, in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 17, which we read last week, into chapter 23, and to almost the end of chapter 24. But it ends at verse 22, this whole section on Amenemope. So let me just give you where the verses start and end there. So that's the Amenemope section. It's a very small section in Proverbs. Any questions on kind of the summary and background information so far?
Is there any particular reason that you'd compare Amenemope very closely with, or I mean, others even have, not just you, others have compared it so closely with this passage when, I mean, I've never read Amenemope, so I would never read this part of Proverbs and say, oh, this is not referencing, this is kind of like how, what do you call it, Peter references one of Crete's own prophets and how they say Cretans are always drunkards and liars, and he says, well, yeah, that's true, therefore rebuke them sharply. He doesn't validate the prophets of Crete, because from my knowledge, this is kind of a question, from my knowledge, that was mentioning not Christian prophets, that was mentioning just, other religions or whatever. And so I'm thinking, he's not affirming the other religions, he's just saying this one thing here is true, and therefore this is what you should do. So I don't know if my question makes sense, I haven't, because I can't compare Amenemope in this chapter. I wouldn't really see very much of a connection because I don't know. So yeah.
So yeah, I think I understand your question. So why, if at all, should we be comparing Amenemope with Proverbs chapters 22 to 24? And is Solomon affirming Amenemope in any way? I think that would be the question. Just correct me if I'm wrong.
Primarily the first one. The second one, because of how Peter handled it. I presume, with many times there's these like there's a reference to the Book of Enoch, but the Book of Enoch as a whole is not accepted into the canon because of theological and other reasons. But and I think that's accurate. But yeah. So my question is more so, what is, in what way is it helpful to mention or consider this? Although others, of course, have. I mean, just on a personal level for you.
Well, it's kind of difficult because I want to balance. On the one hand, ancient Near Eastern literature and parallels are handy because the audience, especially here, Solomon is assuming that his audience knows about the instruction of Menomope. So it's helpful on the one hand. And on the other hand, I want to try to balance that you don't need to be reading a Menomope at all. Trying to balance those two things. So it is helpful. There are some things that, because Solomon is assuming that his audience is familiar with Amenemope, it's helpful to read Amenemope because it can, in a couple little verses, clarify the intended meaning here and there, because you get the broader picture and you get closer to the intended audience that Solomon is writing to, who actually is familiar with Amenemope. So that would be one thing that would be helpful. Another thing would be helpful is that you can see where Solomon has upgraded and even corrected Amenemope's instruction, and you can see how he elevates this pagan teaching to a level where we can call it the inscripturated Word of God, even though it is kind of based on some of the things that Amenemope has written. So that would be another slight benefit. You can see that and compare and contrast them. You can find the text online fairly easily for Amenemope, and you can see the different parallels and connections yourself if you're interested. You don't have to, again, but it can be helpful here and there. And for the last question that I mentioned, okay, is Solomon affirming Amenemope? Is he doing anything like that? Well, kind of. He's affirming the good things about Amenemope. And I think the moral we can get from that is that all truth is God's truth. And just because a pagan, for illustration's sake, says 2 + 2 = 4, doesn't mean that person is automatically wrong. We can still affirm that as true. But Solomon upgrades the other parts as well. And verse 17, you mentioned Enoch, and you mentioned some other things as well, and Paul mentioned, some poets and other people. In verse 17 of chapter 22 in Proverbs, it says, "Pay attention and listen to the words of the wise." So he is affirming, what they got right, at least. And then he says, "Apply your heart to my knowledge." And as he brings up the words of the wise, the words of Amenemope, specifically in this section, he also corrects it, and he also puts his own spin on things. So that's just what I say in response to that. So yeah, on the one hand, it is helpful. On the other hand, it's not necessary for you to be reading Amenemope.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions on the summary and background information? All right, I will assume no questions. And we're just going to get into chapter 23. If you want to be called on to read specifically, we do need readers. Just go ahead to the Bible Study React channel and react to the message in there, and I will call on you to be one of our helpful readers, and we'll just be reading chapter 23. So anyone want to read verses 1 to, let's say, 18?
Again, let me just pull it up. I've got actually eSword already open.
Oh, nice. Prepared.
Yes. um, but I only have the King James right now. I forgot to download anything else. Oops. Not so prepared. So what verse are we in?
1 to 18, chapter 23.
Proverbs 23, 1. You can give me 1 second. I can download my favorite translation here.
All right, 1 second starting now.
Ah!
I'm just kidding. Take your time.
Okay. Think I'm all done. Oh, I have to restart eSword. Okay. Okay, there we go. So Proverbs chapter 23, verse 1 to, where do I stop again?
18.
18, okay. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before you. Put a knife to your throat if you are a man given to appetite. Don't be desirous of his dainties, since they are a deceitful food. Don't weary yourself to be rich. In your wisdom show restraint. Why do you set your eyes on that which is not? For it certainly sprouts wings like an eagle and flies away. Don't eat don't eat the food of him who has a stingy eye, and don't crave his delicacies. For as he thinks about the cost, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. The morsel which you have eaten you shall vomit up, and shall lose your good words. Don't speak in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Don't move the ancient boundary stone. Don't encroach on the fields of the fatherless. For their defender is strong. He will plead their case against you. Apply your heart to instruction, and your ears to the words of knowledge. Don't withhold correction from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he will not die. Punish him with the rod, and save his soul from Sheol. My son, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad, even mine. Yes, my heart will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Don't let your but rather fear Yahweh all day long. Indeed, surely there is a future hope. There is a future hope, and your hope will not be cut off.
Wonderful. So I see a number of, you could say, timeless truths in here, different applications. So I see, number one, discernment when dealing with people who want something from you. We see that in the first couple of verses. Another verse about not focusing on wealth, discernment in who you talk with, and to discipline yourself and your children. And don't envy is going to be one of the big themes in chapters 23 and 24. You're going to see a lot of don't envy this wicked person, don't envy that person, don't envy what this person has, and so on. And opposed to that is fear the Lord. So those are the couple themes you'll see throughout this, couple applications you can also apply to yourself as well. But the first question I have for you guys is in the second verse. If you have a big appetite, put a knife to your throat. What does that mean?
Me.
Go ahead, Matt.
So, in the context of what we're reading, it said just a verse before that, when you sit down with a ruler, consider diligently what is before you. So, what would be sitting down to eat? What's before him is food. Yeah, so putting a knife to his throat, if you're a man given to appetite, means to be very careful, because it seems to present something. It was a bit of a custom in their time that I think it still is for us. If you go over to someone's house, that they would prepare you a courtesy meal and be kind to you in that way. In some cultures, especially Israel, it was much stronger. Such as currently in the Middle East, it is a very strong custom to want to feed your guests. Now, in this context, it's talking about being desirous of his dainties since they're a deceitful food. And then it seems he takes a bit of a side journey to say not wearying ourselves to become rich, in our wisdom show restraint. But I don't really think that's a side comment, because then he says, "Why do you set your eyes on that which is not? For it certainly sprouts wings and flies like an eagle to the skies. Don't eat the food of him who has a stingy eye and crave his delicacies. For as he thinks about the cost, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you." So it seems like there's this idea of someone who appears to be generous and they're rich, but the food's expensive, so he's not really meaning what he's saying there. I'm not really sure what the implications of that would be, if he would later be like, "Oh, yeah, I really, need a favor from you," or to lend some money, or I don't know. I don't know what the implications of that would be, but there is this idea at the beginning part. It's almost like a thematic chiasm of riches and food, a theme of this whole scene of wealth, riches, but the deception of it, and the deception of don't desire to become rich because your money will fly away. It kind of fits in perfectly because serving expensive food and having your money fly away is almost like the same thing. If you have like a big amount of guests, it'll cost a lot to feed them. So, I'm sure that's probably in the context as well. And not to change topics, but actually, there was one thing in the middle here that that I noticed a few verses later that I want to mention later.
Oh, later. Okay.
Yeah, later.
Yeah, we
I was
can hit that
deciding
later.
when to mention it. Yeah.
So yeah, you brought up a few good points. Use the context, which was really good, but there is difficulty there. Where does the context end for this certain section which verse 2 is a part of? Where does it begin? So let's talk about that first. The context is pretty easy to spot if you have the overall structure in mind, which is we're talking about 30 sayings. Chapter 22 to middle of chapter 22, the middle of chapter 24, we're talking about 30 sayings, and each saying can stand on its own, but also the sayings can help one another's in context and meaning. So it is a little difficult. So most translations do these 30 sayings really well. So it's difficult when we were looking at the collections, right? Our translations didn't help us at all. They didn't set these collections off in nice big paragraphs for us. But in Proverbs Chapter 22, 17 to 24, middle of that, we do have our translations helping us out. So the CSB, for instance, will set these off in paragraphs. The NASB will set these different 30 sayings off in the bolded numbers. That's how they do paragraphs. And you can see those paragraphs in your own translation. Most of them, I think. I haven't seen one that doesn't. But verses 1 to 3 is one saying. It's in its own paragraph. So don't be greedy for his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. And verses 4 to 5 actually start this new saying. So they are separate in context, but they can still influence each other just because they're so close together. But it's not a very strong connection. So I would say just be a little careful if anyone's making a connection between two different sayings. But it could be, especially if they're talking about the same theme. So for that, I think you interpreted verse 2 very well. Putting a knife to your throat just means being very careful, not gobbling up all the food or anything like that, because it's deceptive food. And I would say it's deceptive because the ruler wants something from you. Rulers are very busy people. When they invite people to eat with them, they're most likely looking for something. They want a favor, perhaps, or doing it for publicity or something like that. Deceptive food. So I would say, yeah, you got that very well. And Carrie says, especially verses 4 and 5, reminds her that everything on earth is temporary. And I think that's an excellent point, because this helps balance us out very strongly against the prosperity gospel that people sometimes see, at least for them in Proverbs. I don't think it's there. They sometimes see the prosperity gospel in Proverbs, a big focus on, oh, go ahead and gain all the wealth and prosperity you can, and God will bless you and all of that, and he will most certainly do that, they say. And in verses 4 to 5 it just says, don't exhaust yourself in the pursuit of wealth. And they have a big focus on wealth. That's what they do. And if you make your eyes rush at it, it's no longer there. It's transient, fades away, it poofs away. Wealth will surely grow wings and fly off to the sky. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Carrie. And any other questions on 1 to 18?
Like, the whole section, or just what we were talking about?
Yeah, either one.
Oh, okay. Well, my question was when it says, "Don't withhold correction from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he won't die."
Hmm.
Verse 14: "Punish him with the rod and save his soul from Sheol." That sounds like, with my New Testament um, glasses of theology, that could be a reference to hell, since we know that Christ did not come to destroy or reinvent the law, but to fulfill it, and therefore to institute the new and better covenant in His blood. So when he talked about hell, we as Christians believe that he didn't come up with something new; it was something there all along. Just as Paul talks about the mystery concealed in the Scriptures. So when it talks about Sheol here, do you think in context it was or could be referencing hell, or do you think it was just talking about punishing him to save him from death? Like Sheol is just used as you'll save him from doing stupid things and dying.
Yeah, I would think that would be the safest interpretation. And Proverbs doesn't talk about eternal punishment much at all. I mean, there are a couple verses that you could say that kind of hints at eternal punishment and might kind of hint to eternal life. I think we read one of those verses that might hint to eternal life, where it was talking about hope that would never perish. And surely you will have that. Yeah, verse 18, then you will have a future, for what you hope for will not be cut off. So, possibly talking about eternal life. We don't get the full picture, even if it was talking about eternal life or eternal death in Proverbs. So I do think the safest interpretation is, yeah, we're probably just talking about death here. Sheol simply meant death or the grave, and it sometimes is hinted at that it can mean more, but it usually doesn't. And in Proverbs, usually Sheol and death simply meant, just physically dying from doing something stupid or being wicked and being punished for that by authorities and other people and things like that. So I think that would be the safest interpretation.
Okay. Thank you.
And one more point, verses 10 to 11, talking about the ancient boundary marker or stone. We covered that in a previous study where Solomon was talking about the same thing that it is right here, where you had land markers, boundaries for someone's land, and usually that was inherited, especially in Israel, and it was pretty much a sacred thing. If you read through Joshua, you'll hear about, okay, these land allotments, these cities to this particular tribe, that particular tribe, so on and so forth. So they were a sacred thing, and you shouldn't be moving those boundary stones or anything like that. For their Redeemer is strong, he will take up their fight against you. That could be referring to God, most likely is referring to God, and he will oppose the wicked person who is moving those boundaries around, most likely trying to get more land for himself. All right, now let's get to the next section then. Verses 19 to 35. We'll finish off this chapter. And let's see. So, Dogman, could you read 19 to 35?
Oh, sure. Hello?
Hi.
Yes. I will continue reading from the WEB. I think that's what Matt was reading from. Listen, my son, and be wise, and keep your heart on the right path. Don't be among ones drinking too much wine, or those who gorge themselves on meat. The drunkard and the glutton shall become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. Listen to your father who gave you life, and don't despise your mother when she is old. Buy the truth and don't sell it. Get wisdom, discipline, and understanding. The father of the righteous has a great joy. Whoever fathers a wise child delights in him. Let your father and your mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes keep in my ways. For a prostitute is a deep pit, and a wayward wife is a narrow well. Yes, she lies in wait like a robber, and increases the unfaithful among men. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? Those who stay long at the wine. Those who go to seek out mixed wine. Don't look at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will imagine confusing things. Yes, you will be as he who lies down in the middle of the sea, or as he who lies on top of the rigging. They hit me, and I was not hurt. They beat me, and I don't feel it. When will I wake up? I can do it again. I can find another.
All right, perfect. So that was 19 to 35, and hopefully you could see, especially if you're looking at a translation that makes it obvious, you could see where those different sayings are kind of separated. So you have verse 19 is one saying, verses 20 to 21 is another saying. Real obvious one is 29 to 35, where it talks about the drunkard. And you can see that that saying is, one whole section. So a couple of things that I see in here, as far as timeless truths and things you can apply to yourself go. Number one would be to abstain from drunkenness and gluttony. So drunkenness is an obvious one, and we're all familiar with that, but it also notes abstain from gluttony. I see listen to your parents. I see gain wisdom, and also to beware the adulteress. And then it ends that section with another mention of, beware of drunkenness. Also kind of puts it in, a very enticing light. Those who spend time over their wine don't gaze at the red wine as it gives color to the cup, might glide down smoothly, and then he gives you, this is what drunkenness actually does. It impairs you, it hurts you, and at the end, when will I wake up? I'll go get another drink. So that is the drunkard. So any questions or comments on 19 to 35?
What do you think that it means by buy the truth and don't sell it? Get wisdom and discipline and understanding. Now I know that wisdom and knowledge and understanding, these are three things mentioned a lot, along with the fear of the Lord, in the book of Proverbs. But when it says buy truth and don't sell it, what do you think that means spiritually or practically? And how do you think we could apply that? Because I understand the parallel between the foolishness of riches, the wisdom of gaining knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and the fact that no amount of riches is worth giving that up. I understand that. But do you think there's anything more that I'm missing there? Because when you read that, it doesn't really have much communication effect. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, what does that mean?
Yeah, before I answer that, let me clarify one thing. I think I shouldn't be relying too much on the CSB and other translations. It seems like sometimes they split those sayings up too much. Verses 19 to 21 is actually one saying, even though the CSB kind of splits it up there. And the other ones are kind of together as well. And it looks like the NASB kind of gets a little off track. Of course, the different sayings are difficult to categorize. It's not entirely obvious what constitutes one of the sayings or not. People might differentiate 30 sayings in a different way than someone else. So I just want to bring up that point. Just ignore what I said about the saying divisions. And it's a little more difficult than that, than simply looking at a translation, it seems. But, there are some obvious ones, like 29 to 35. So that one I mentioned, that's still a very obvious one. That's just talking about the drunkard. So just be careful when looking at the different sayings. Anyway, to your question. So your question got back to pretty much that close part. And what does that mean is the question. So I'll just bring that out to you guys. What do you think verse 23 means? Buy the truth, don't sell it. And how do you do that? Is there like a truth store you can go to? Get truth points? Don't sell your truth points?
You're starting to make me think of ideas for a video game. I need my truth points.
Yeah, so Carrie says, as for 23, interpret it as to not withhold knowledge if you have it. So maybe share your truth points with others, but don't sell and give away your truth points so that you don't have them anymore.
I'll let you say your thoughts before I say mine, because...
I was just going to repeat what the others were saying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think we got some good ideas. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, well, I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind when I'm studying it and I look at it, and I look at everything that's been talked about, probably a couple of verses before, couple of sentences before, rather. I don't, other than the, what's it called? What are the things? Oh, the word is gone. What are we studying about? Like thematic chiasm. Other than the chiastic separations, there wasn't really separations for these. So, having it talk about riches and rich food and them expecting you to kind of pay them back somehow, and then it talking about the value. Essentially, it's kind of like when Christ, at least in my mind, when Christ told us it's better for you to go to heaven without one eye or one arm than to have your whole body thrown in hell. And then where he said, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's kind of like that for me. I think of it as it's giving us a scale on which to value something. For example, the severity of sin is very heavy, more important than our own physical well-being. Now, granted, no Christians really ever condoned this as a practice, but as a explanation to describe the severity of sin and the "it would be better if" scenario. I think it's the same thing kind of here, where it's talking about the value of riches, about don't sell it. It's worth more, it's worth more than money, any money, all money. Don't sell it and buy it. So use what you have as far as physical resources to gain wisdom, not to gain more money. And so if you have time, if you have access to the internet, if you have money in general, use this to become wise, to become God-fearing in the context of Proverbs wisdom. Use this to become more wise and not to become more rich, because riches will just fleet away. Now that's me constructing it from the context and from kind of, the saying, slightly metaphoric sort of way of communicating stuff. It doesn't have a direct context or a direct application to a very practical part of our lives.
Yeah, I think you can definitely, it's a possibility to make that connection. It's definitely an implication you can draw from the text. And when you're looking at it, he does talk about wealth and riches. And even if we take verse 23 as metaphorical as it is, why does he use that metaphor of buying and selling something? Well, perhaps he's meaning to connect that to one of the previous sayings about about wealth and about riches and things like that. So, that's a genuine possibility. And Dogman suggests maybe it's just a metaphor. And yeah, I do think it's a metaphor. And the other question is, how far does this metaphor go exactly? Is the metaphor about buying itself, where it just is a metaphor for gaining wealth? Or do we take buying as, okay, buying books and things like that? Because those kinds of writings do cost money. They costed money back in Proverbs times. So yeah, that stuff costs money. So maybe it is talking about buying physical things in order to gain wealth. Perhaps it just means buying physical things to gain wisdom, not wealth. And perhaps it just means to gain wisdom and truth in whatever ways you can. I think the selling part, though, I don't think it means to share that wisdom or anything, or truth or anything like that. I think it means, as opposed to buying it, I think it means to give it away so that you don't have it anymore, to lose it pretty much. So I think that part, yeah, it's definitely metaphorical for losing the truth as opposed to gaining it, which is buying the truth. But either way, I think your application still stands, Matt. Either even if we're talking about gaining truth or really buying truth, I think your application stands that we should be spending our money, our wealth, and things like that for good things like truth and wisdom. And here's where I'm going to plug in a Logos Bible software package for you guys. I'm just kidding. But that's just one option of many, you know. Spend your wealth on that good stuff to gain truth, to gain wisdom, especially when, as it said earlier, verses 4 and 5, you know, you can look around at your wealth and riches and it's just going to fly away like an eagle. All right, any final questions or thoughts on this last section, verses 19 to 35?
A lot of it talks about alcohol.
Talks a lot
not
about
all.
alcohol, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is like it gives a lot of very like in the New Testament it just says don't become drunk because that's debauchery and you know it's the flesh. But in Proverbs it kind of displays in a greater and graver detail what actually happens about how it bites back like a snake and how it looks appealing and you know how your eyes will see strange things like I just find it helpful but also humorous that it would be giving such a clear description to what do you call it a people who are so used to alcohol and getting drunk. I'm thankful for it because I've never drunk wine or gotten drunk, so I don't need to get drunk to know what it feels like. It tells me right here. So and it's very helpful in that. I think that's what I'm seeing is that its goal, just as it's saying don't withhold correction from a child, then it talks about my son. So that's verse 13 and 15. My son, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad. So there's this idea of like training your children, even though this wasn't just like a children's handbook. Of course, this wasn't directed towards children, but this is being written in a way that's like my son. And then he's describing what happens when you the bad things that happen when you get drunk, and saying this is not good. Don't even go there. And I think it's just like with the it sounds like the loving words of a father describing something to a kind of naive son, if that makes sense. Same with the seductive woman about how if you go down her what do you call it, where her house is, she'll meet you and you know embrace you and say, "Oh, I've been waiting just for you," and your life will be ruined from then on. And then he explains what'll happen. The husband will find out. You'll get beat up. You'll be out of money because of her. And so don't do that. Don't give in to her sweet words. Instead, fear the Lord. And then at the end, he talks about a virtuous woman that is, you know, fears the Lord and works diligently and wakes up early and goes to bed late, serving the Lord and her family. And that's the kind of woman that a Christian woman that Christian men are supposed to seek. So it sounds a lot like this fatherly instruction towards a son, I mean, or a daughter, you know, we can apply it like that, but it says son, so I say son, towards a child that is to prevent. It doesn't sound like he's talking to someone who has experienced these sins and is well acquainted with them. He talks like someone who is giving the necessary details, not full details, but necessary ones, so that we would not even go near these things and not even like not get drunk, not commit adultery or whatever. And I think that just now as I'm reading this, I'm really kind of grasping that sense of it, and it really helps me understand the whole book of Proverbs as a whole. It's written with that motivation of this kind of instructive love of a father to his child. And I really do think that was the desire of God in its formation, in its existence, and in its preservation to us today, is that we would be fathered by the Lord and by the Holy Spirit, and that we would not get drunk with wine, that we would not, you know, walk in the way of temptation, whether on the internet or hang around with people that are seductive and will lead us into sin, but instead to fellowship with people who encourage us like it says in the New Testament, to walk in purity, and there's a verse where Paul says to Timothy that we ought to fellowship with those who sincerely seek the Lord with a pure heart, but I'm paraphrasing that because I forget the quote. But yeah, so I'm just appreciative of that in the study, and yeah, the fatherly love of the Lord that would teach us these wise truths and help us to be genuine Christians full of wisdom. Because I would always ask God, how do I live my life? How do I make choices? And as I read Proverbs, I saw that this is how. And this is how God wants us to lead our lives, taking responsibility, learning wisdom, and walking in the reverent and humble fear of the Lord, and making our choices in that regard, knowing that one day we'll give an account to Him, but knowing also that our earthly choices do have earthly consequences. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, it's fine, I guess, either way, because there's two camps when it comes to this. But, um, what y'all think? Like, let's say someone, I guess let's make an example. Let's say right now, after we got off this call, let's say I went to a restaurant, I had a meal, and let's say I had let's say a glass of wine, right? And then I went home, and that was about it. Do you guys think that we're permitted to drink alcohol as long as we're not drunk, in the sense that the actual act of drinking alcohol? Like, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think the problem is drunkenness there. So if you just had a little bit of wine, you didn't get drunk, you don't become a drunkard like the person described at the end, which, as Matt said, I do agree that I think it's humorous. And I think it was meant to be a little humorous in its description, especially the last line there. Oh, I think I'll get another drink after all of that. But yeah, I think the issue is drunkenness. And if we look at the other passages in Proverbs, wine is looked on very nicely. Let's see, Proverbs 3:10. Then your granaries will be filled, your vats overflow with new wine. And in chapter 9, wisdom personified has built her house, carved her 7 pillars, prepared her food, spiced her wine, and drink the wine I have mixed, she says. And other places, wine can be bad for drunkenness and things like that. And if we look at the New Testament especially, we see that drunkenness is the only thing condemned as far as alcohol goes. We see other places where Paul actually recommends Timothy to drink some wine for his ailments, not just water, but, got an upset stomach or whatever. Have some wine, Timothy, says Paul. And so I would agree that, I don't know if I'm agreeing with you. I don't think I got your stance on it, but I would say it's drunkenness that's condemned.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. Like, for me, I grew up in a household, and my childhood church is different than what I believe now. And I was always taught oh no, all alcohol is bad no matter what and everything. But that's kind of as I grew up and I started to read the Bible for myself and everything, I came to a conclusion that, just like you guys were saying in the chat, and then you guys were saying in the call here, that it's that's the actual act of it. Alcohol itself is not sinful unless you make it sinful. Even gluttony, for that matter, it's eating itself isn't sinful, but if you eat a lot, it becomes sin, right?
Yep. That's at least I think all of us here would generally agree with you, because everything Mark said. Yeah, I can't really say it any better. But
Yeah.
basically, that's what we want to avoid is the indulging of the flesh or seeking other things as our comfort or as our solution to our problems. Whether that's video games as our solution for our stress, which I'm guilty of sometimes, or whether it's eating or drinking. These are all physical, fleshly ways to try and resolve problems. Doesn't mean it's wrong to enjoy eating or to enjoy juice or wine in your instance. It's not wrong to enjoy and thank God for these things, but it's when these things become an idol that we see, eating really become an issue, and gluttony really like a big issue, or drunkenness where the father's irresponsible because he's dealing with bitterness and so he just drinks his sorrow away, or the absent father who's just workaholic or playing too many video games. It's when they make an idol out of these things that we're supposed to be thanking God for, generally speaking, thanking God for our food and our what we drink and for our even times of relaxation and enjoyment. We're supposed to be glorifying God for all these things and doing it for his glory, not making a God out of them so that we would try and heal ourselves from our pain. Instead, we bring those pains to God, and he promises that he will work in our lives, and he will counsel us and heal and help us according to his will and plan and purpose. So, yeah.
Yeah, nice. I think most of us are in agreement there. And if you do disagree, that's fine. You can take a look at some of the verses where it is recommended for people to drink wine in the Bible. That's where I would start. And couple that with drunkenness being condemned, and I think you can come to our conclusion that we just got to. And Hat says, I put it under a food sacrifice to idols situation or category. Yeah, I'd say it's that, kind of that, yeah, pretty much. It is a conscience matter, and it's also a discernment matter as well, that you don't get drunk on it, and that it doesn't become an idol, and that you're not becoming tempted to make it an idol or anything like that, because it is addicting stuff, especially nowadays. So, you have to have that level of carefulness in addition to just not being drunk. You have to have that level of carefulness to flee from temptation. In other words, you should also be wise and discerning. And we're not talking about 100% all the time, do this, do that. Wise and discerning, applying Proverbs, things like that. But alright, we got to keep going. We'll get into chapter 24 now. We'll try to get through this a little quicker. Hopefully we do. I don't know if we can. But verses 1 to 22. Hat, could you please read 1 to 22 in chapter 24?
Hey.
I don't know if you started yet, but I can't hear you.
Great.
I heard that, yes. Whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. It's a little choppy, but I think it's fine. Oh, no, I can't hear you at all, Hat. Maybe we'll go to someone else. Rip lag.
Will temporarily rename myself Hat's name and take the place.
Well, it rhymes at least. So, Matt, 1 to 22.
Oh, I have time to change my username. Okay. Chapter 24, verses 1 to 22, you said?
Yep.
Okay. I have to actually type it in. There we go. I sound like Hat. Okay. Verse 1. Don't be envious of evil men. Rather desire to be... hold on. Don't be envious of evil men, neither desire to be with them. I'm sorry, my eyes are a little tired. My bad. Verse 2. For their hearts plot violence, and their lips talk about mischief. Through wisdom a house is built, by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all rare and beautiful treasure. A wise man has great power, and a knowledgeable man increases strength. For by wise guidance you wage your war, and victory is in many advisers. Wisdom is too high for a fool. He doesn't open his mouth in the gate. One who plots to do evil will be called a schemer. The schemes of folly are sin. The mocker is detested by men. If you falter in the time of trouble, your strength is small. Rescue those who are being led away to death, like those who are staggering to the slaughter. If you say, Behold, we didn't know this, doesn't he who weighs the hearts consider it? Sorry, the way I said that. Doesn't he who weighs the hearts consider it? He who keeps your soul, doesn't he know it? Shall he not render to every man according to his work? Ooh, that's a verse about eternal judgment. Sorry, I'll continue. Verse 13. My son, eat honey, for it is good, the droppings of the honeycomb, which are sweet to your taste. So you shall know wisdom to be to your soul, if you have found it. Then there will be a reward, for your hope will not be cut off. Verse 15. Don't lay in wait, wicked man, against the habitation of the righteous. Don't destroy his resting place. For a righteous man falls 7 times and rises up again, but the wicked are overthrown by calamity. Don't rejoice when your enemy falls. Don't let your heart be glad when he is overthrown, lest Yahweh see it and it displease him. And when he turns away his wrath from him, and then he turns away his wrath from him. Yeah, that's the end of the sentence there. Don't fret yourself because of evildoers, neither be envious of the wicked, for there will be no reward to the evil man, and the lamp of the wicked shall be snuffed out. My son, fear Yahweh and the king. Don't join those who are rebellious, for their calamity will rise suddenly, and destruction from them both. Who knows? The destruction from them both. Okay. What verse did you want me to read to there, Mark?
Just 22. I think you got there.
Oh, yeah, I did. It's sometimes it's weird. It's like when I have my headphones on, it's hard for me to talk because I can't hear myself, so I mispronunciate a few words. I don't know why.
No, that's fine. So, verse 12, you mentioned that perhaps that's a verse about eternal judgment. He who guards you will know it and repay each one as his deeds deserve. That's possible. It's possible it's talking about eternal judgment there. We know that that will happen in some form. The general principle of that God will repay each one. We know that will happen at eternal judgment. Whether or not Solomon was intending that there, I don't know. And I'm not sure we can make a strong conclusion about that, because we do know elsewhere in all of Proverbs there's this very strong temporal kind of perspective and mindset where even the wicked, they'll be punished temporally, and the foolish person, he'll be punished temporally for the foolish things that he does. And those punishments, all the specific ones, at least in Proverbs that have been mentioned, were all temporal as far as we can kind of nail them down, such as I have also in mind, I think chapter 5, where the adulterous man, he sleeps with someone's wife, and that husband is now very angry at him, and he won't be swayed by a bribe, and he's aiming to kill the adulterer. So that's a specific temporal punishment. I can't really think of an example in Proverbs that isn't like that. So I don't know if we're talking about eternal judgment or not. It's definitely an option, and we know from the New Testament that this principle of God repaying each one according to his deeds most certainly extends into the afterlife. So I don't know, but just wanted to bring that out, that there's some question about that. All right, some of the applications, timeless truths I see here. Number 1, we see don't be envious. That was repeated. Again, we saw that in chapter 23. Don't be envious, especially of evil people. In verse 1, wisdom brings riches in the home. And these could be metaphorical riches. It could also be material riches. But either way, we have to balance it with verses 4 and 5 of chapter 23, which says that, don't spend your time focusing on those things because they're fleeting. There are much better things that you can be focusing on. In other places, verses 5 to 6, similar to knowledge is power, except it's not just knowledge, it's applying that knowledge, it's using discernment. And war and counselors here may only be applicable to a king, but I think that's just an illustration for the general principle, because everything else in these 30 sayings have been for the common everyday man, common everyday son even. So perhaps it's more directed at the principle there, which would be in, be discerning, get advice from others, even if you're not a king with counselors around you all the time. I also see be courageous and productive in the day of distress. And wisdom is sweet as honey. And that would be in verses 13 to 14, which is a single saying. And you can see that he's making the comparison between wisdom and honey there. And there's also an interesting one about to not associate with revolutionaries or rebellious people in verses 21 to 22, but fear the Lord and the king, who's also been compared to God in other places in Proverbs, insofar as that king is just and righteous and good and will punish those revolutionaries, those rebellers. All right, any questions, thoughts? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I spoke too early, but yeah, just I want to make sure I understand that correctly. In this context, it's revolutionaries against God, right? Like it'd be against like God and like the Bible and all that stuff. Not like it's not talking about revolutionaries like overall, like outside of God's kingdom, like the American Revolution, for an example.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, actually. What do you guys think about that? Does this talking about all revolutionaries, even like in secular contexts?
Which verse?
Verse 21.
All right, thank you. Well, see, my translation translates it, don't join those who are rebellious. So if we look at the word in 21 for rebellious, 21 or 22? No, 21. It'll not with them that are given to change. Okay, so interesting. I'm going to just stick to the not strongs for now because it was melting my brain. It just seems like in the context it's speaking about rebellious to the Lord, like fear Yahweh and the king. So it could have an idea there, generally speaking, if you took that word king. But I mean, the whole passage is really about not envying the rich. Don't plot evil. You shall know wisdom shall be sweet to your soul. Don't rejoice when the enemy falls, lest Yahweh see it and displease him. So although it mentions king and like plotting evil, generally the focus in the context of this all is generally the Lord and the reason to follow it being the Lord. So rebellion would be to the Lord in that context. Of course, you can apply that to the king generally, but it doesn't really seem to be the emphasis in this verse. It's at least what I see. What do you see, Mark?
Well, I guess we have some options. I mean, oh yeah, Fang's bringing up Romans 13, which is good. I'm trying to not get into the whole political-esque debate as well, in addition to this. But, yeah, it's a good question. I think the issue is, are we taking Adonai, or God, Yahweh, Lord, and the king as two kind of separate things? Don't be a rebellious person, but fear God and also fear the king. Or are we talking about both of them together, but fear Adonai and as well as the king, so to speak? So that's the question. Are we kind of making a separation there, that you should be fearing God in all instances, but also in general? Of course, kings are fallible. Proverbs knows that. In general, yeah, you should be fearing the king and not being a rebellious person against the king. So that would be the question. And I think that's a good question too, Roro. Are we talking about the same person in that last line of verse 21? Fear Adonai, who is the king. So that's a possibility. I'm not sure the grammar really supports that. So just a note on capitalization. Hebrew doesn't have the capitalization, the original Hebrew text, and it doesn't use capitalization in that way either. So you got to be a little careful of that. When you do see capital letters for God and for other nouns referring to God or pronouns referring to God that are capitalized, those are the translator's interpretation of what's going on. Now, the translator is probably going to be right most of the time if you're reading a good translation. So I think we have three options here. So are we talking about, number one, fear God and also the king? Or are we talking about fear God, but also fear the king, where they're kind of separated a little bit? Actually, the first one would be fear God as well as the king. Second option, fear God, but also fear the king, where they're kind of separated. The third option would be fear God who is the king. So we got a couple options there, I'd say. I don't know if there's enough. Yeah, I don't think the third option would be a possibility, though, because we do have the strong vav construction between Lord and king in the Hebrew. So the word and there is pretty strong, and it's there in the Hebrew text, the conjunction, which kind of shows that we're not talking about the same person. So yeah, that's why I would say the translators don't capitalize the K there, because we have the conjunction and between those two words. Anyway, I think that's a good time to stop there, especially since we're running low on time. Not the whole study, just that one portion. You guys can look more into it. Romans 13 is an excellent passage to consider as well. And also considering, what does Proverbs mean about rebellion here? Just any kind of rebellion, or the specific bad kind of rebellion? How do we view these kings here? If he is making this comparison between God and the king, then we're talking about a good king, a just, righteous king. So what happens if you have a bad king, a very bad king? So yeah, that's a study for you guys later on. You can come to your own conclusion on that. Anyway, let's get to the last section, verses 23 to 34. I don't know if your internet's good yet, Pat. Oh, you removed your reaction.
I could read that.
All right, Dogman, go ahead.
Right. Small. All right. Same WEB as well. These are also sayings of the wise. To show partiality in judgment is not good. He who says to the wicked, "You are righteous," people will curse him, and the nations will abhor him. But it will go well with those who convict the guilty, and a rich blessing will come to them. An honest answer is like a kiss on the lips. Prepare your work outside and get your fields ready. Afterwards, build your house. Don't be a witness against your neighbor without cause. Don't deceive with your lips. Don't say, "I will do to him as he has done to me. I will repay the man according to his work." I went by the field of the sluggard, by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. Behold, it was all grown over the thorns. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. And I saw and considered well. I saw and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So your poverty will come as a robber, and your want as an armed man.
Nice. So here's some real quick timeless truths and applications here. Don't show partiality right at the beginning. Don't lie about wickedness. Rebuke the wicked. Prepare your basic necessities first before building a home. And this could be applied to all big undertakings as well. That's a possibility. Kind of a metaphor for all big undertakings that you're going through. Don't take revenge, especially if that involves deceit. And that was an interesting one because that is all part of, one whole saying. So verse 28, don't be a witness against your neighbor for no reason. Would you use your lips to deceive? Don't say, "I'll do to him what he did to me. I'll pay him back what his deeds deserve." So perhaps his neighbor was being deceitful, lying about him, and being a bad witness. And so, I'll just be a bad witness to him too. I'll be deceitful. Don't do that. Don't take revenge. And also at the end, don't be lazy, but be diligent. And you can see what laziness looks like. He gives a description of what that looks like. So one more thing to note, kind of overall, kind of the meta thing going on here. Verse 23 gives us another title, another subheading. These also are sayings of the wise. So this verse 22, right before that, ends the entire Amenemope section. Then we get into another section. These also are the sayings of the wise. Now, I don't know where these came from, if they came from Solomon only, or other people that he's drawing from. Either way, it's Solomon writing this. It's another original work. He's basing this off of the sayings of the wise. Perhaps it's from him, perhaps it's influenced by other wise people that he sees are speaking truth, and all truth is God's truth. So those are the possibilities. And after that, of course, we get into another section, verse 1 of chapter 25, which we'll get into next week, of the men of Hezekiah who have transcribed Solomon's Proverbs. But this is the next section, and it's actually a collection as well. So, what kind of collection is this section, verses 23 to 34? What do you guys think? As you're taking a look at that, I'll just go ahead and review for us the sections and collections that we looked at from before. So yeah, the earlier you guys get this, the earlier we can close the Bible study out. So number 1, you have parallel collections, Proverbs grouped in an A-B pattern. So topic A, then the author switches, here's topic B, then he goes back to topic A, then he goes to topic B. You have a chiastic collection, A, B, then he reverses that pattern, B, then A. Catchword, it's a group of proverbs or a section that's grouped by a single catchword or phrase. Thematic collection, group of proverbs that are grouped by the same kind of theme. Perhaps he's talking about, here's a bunch of kings in this section, or maybe I'm just going to talk about wealth in this section. Number 5, an inclusio collection, where you have a collection that's bookended by the same or very similar word, phrase, or theme starting at the beginning, and then you have that same thing right at the end of that section. So what kind of collection are we looking at here? 23 to 34. I'll give you guys a couple hints. Number 1, you can ignore the title. These also are the sayings of the wise. You can just ignore that. That's just a title there. And number 2 is that collections and patterns can be longer than individual verses. So maybe if you have a pattern A, it extends a couple verses, and then B extends a couple verses. So Roro suggests perhaps it's a parallel collection. What would that parallel be? If you could outline it and kind of write out the topics. Yeah, there can be themes. It can be thematic. There can also be themes within parallels and chiasms. Usually are. But the chiasm or parallel is more specific than a thematic. Okay, so Roro's bringing up some good stuff. So perhaps we see honesty here, working hard, and we see about speech and work ethic in other areas. I think you're very, very close there. And I think you got it. Yeah, you definitely got the parallel there, Roro. You could get a little more specific on the different topics, but you nailed that parallel very well. Here's what our commentary here's how our commentary lays it out. He goes a little more specific. So instead of just talking about speech, he's more specific and says law courts. So hopefully that kind of shows it a little clearer. But yeah, 24, and it starts at the latter half of 23, wherever you want to put that. But yeah, pretty much 23 to 26 on the law courts, which, yeah, it involves speech. And then you have economic principles, which, talk about your work ethic. So yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd agree with you there, Roro. And 28 to 29, we go back to law courts. That's topic A again. Then topic B, we talk about laziness, which, have to do with economic priorities and all that good stuff. All right. Any final questions before we close this out? I see you there, Matt. What's up?
Oh no, I'm thinking if I have any questions. No, not really.
All right.
I wish that there was some way we could implement this better, because maybe I've just seen too many documentaries, but feeling like justice is always perverted for the highest bidder in America is kind of a depressing thought, that just whoever has the most money can bribe justice. It really brings reminiscent feelings to when Israel was falling and God was severely angry with the injustice and corruption of the justice system that he established. So when it talks about But it will go well with those who convict the guilty, and a rich blessing will come on them. Or in the verse before that, he who says to the wicked, "You are righteous," peoples will curse him, and nations will abhor him. It's quite difficult because when Christianity is removed as the heart and soul of a country, then there's no moral absolute standard, and then people, especially liberal progressive people, really, it seems, really try and push for legalizing all forms of abhorrent sin and to make it normalized, to make kid shows about it. It feels as though what once was outlawed is now acceptable because we changed the laws, because without scripture being the absolute law, what are laws but our decisions? So I wish there was some way that I could say how do we implement this, but really other than just living righteously and not compromising but still walking in love, there's really nothing we can do, as far as I know, to change the injustice that isn't really in our hands, so to speak. It's in the hands of the judges and the jurisdictions and the lawmakers and passers and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I like what you brought up with the proverb there, where it does say that someone saying that wickedness is right, he'll be abhorred by the population, but it seems like those consequences have been kind of reversed in our society. The person who says that wickedness is right is now being celebrated by a lot of people. It's just another note that Proverbs is about general principles. But yeah, especially your other point where, what can we do? What can we do about that? And Hat said we can live it out in our own lives. That's definitely something that we can do. Another thing we can do is, spread those good morals and ethics, make more Christians, evangelize people, do the Great Commission, make disciples of all nations. That would certainly help as well. But yeah, other than that, in a big picture kind of scale, it's difficult for us to really immediately and kind of change the tide or anything like that. But there are some things that we can do, especially in our own lives.
Yeah, amen about the Great Commission and all, because, if you remember, in the Roman government, it was very, very corrupt. As far as laws on marriage, laws on, just there was slavery, there was a whole lot of stuff going on, and what Christians did is they simply lived out the gospel, and they continued to preach and to be martyrs, and the gospel continued to spread until it overtook the Roman Empire as a whole. It took about, from what I know, 300 years, give or take. But after a while, the seed of the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs rather, became the seed of the saints, so to speak, the seed of saints being Christians. And so it's a comforting thing to remember that where we came from is amidst great hostility, animosity, ridicule, and abhorrence in the midst of a perverse and wicked generation. We are called, and then Christians were called to shine like stars in the universe, being thankful and grateful and humble and loving and holy in the midst of complaining and cruel and all forms of wickedness of the culture and society around us.
Yeah,
so it's a good reminder.
It's all good stuff. And Hat opens up another can of worms about voting. That's another thing that we can look on at our own time, along with the other part, which was about rebelling and rebellions and things like that. Anyway,
that mean
we'll close
we
it
can't
out.
overthrow the government, Mark? Please?
We'll start with our Bible study, grassroots overthrow.
Okay. Yes,
right.
Rise, Bible study.
No. Well, Dogman was the last to read, and I guess we're off to Matt now. Could you close us out with a word of prayer?
Yes. I will resist the temptation to do jokes now. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time we've had to study. Please bless each and every one of us, and help us, O Lord, to live the gospel through our lives and to be a light. Help us, O Lord, to walk in righteousness and integrity and wisdom, knowing that we belong to a kingdom that's foundation cannot be shaken, a kingdom which laws and integrity have been displayed in your word, that we ought to live righteous, holy, God-fearing lives. I pray that you would help us to do that. You would help us to be diligent and work as if we were working unto you, to be like stars shining in the darkness, to be a light, that, oh Lord, you would shine through us with your word, with your love, with your truth, without compromise and without hatred or wrath. I pray, Heavenly Father, that you would help us to do what you have called us to do, and that we would grow in wisdom, that we would grow in grace, that we would abound in good works, and that we would bring you glory, Heavenly Father, and that your steadfast love and mercy would be upon us. And we thank you, dear Lord, for your mercy and for your steadfast love, and for your grace, which enables and empowers us to be able to follow you, as you have called us to do. Thank you. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.